Okay, good morning or good afternoon or wherever you are. Welcome back to How to Be Smarter Than Your Teacher, which it's just a renaming because my students have told me this is really not an AP review, which is fair. The AP is a pretty simplified item, and we are trying to go a little bit deeper, make America a little more informed again, try and bring peace, unity, and love back to the world. And to do that, we've got to go to the heart of the revolution. And the heart of the revolution is to be found, believe it or not, in the Articles of Confederation, which is a document that gets very short shrift. A lot of teachers don't want to pay much attention to it. It only existed, in terms of it being enforced from 1781 to 1787. So it's a very short, 1789 officially when the Constitution is adopted, but it's a very short-lived document. But it does contain in it the highest ideals and hopes of the people who wrote our Declaration of Independence. It contains this real belief in human beings, belief in the states. It's a tremendously hopeful document. And it should let you know a basic truth, which is that in despair are the seeds of peace. This document was not going to work for the United States of America. And eventually we despaired of it, and we came up with a much more pragmatic and frankly less hopeful document in our Constitution, which we've kept, of course, until this day. Now, my strong urging to you is this document's about 6 pages long. You should read it, and you should really think about 4 basic issues. So read it through, make some highlights, and then look at the document that I've attached here, because I think you should think about, essentially 4 things: lawyers, guns, money, and finally the particularism versus universalism that we spoke of in our first video. And you want to look for those things. Where's the law? Where is the military? And where is money in this document? So if you need to press pause, do so. Otherwise, we're gonna move on here, and we should make some notes. Like, now that you're unpaused and you're back, first you understand that reading law is difficult because basically every word matters, right? And it theoretically it all matters. They don't write extra words in a law. On the other hand, we are going to pick things. So you may have picked other things, and that's really important, and you should discuss with your friends. Obviously, you can't talk to me because I'm not with you. But you do want to sort of now think about my little introduction here, which is that this document, to understand it, you have to go back to 1688. In 1688, if you want to click on the document, you can. You'll see that the local parliaments in Great Britain were subsumed into the one British Parliament, and that's the Parliament in London. And interestingly enough, the Americas didn't have representation, not directly in that parliament. Now, many Englishmen were not allowed to vote. It was pretty common to not be able to vote in England, but everybody had a parliamentarian because England was divided up into districts. Even if you didn't have the property qualifications to vote, you could still petition your member of parliament. You could walk to their office, you could talk to them, and people did. So as we cross through American history, as we get to our revolution, as you probably know, the English fought a war for us with our help, with a lot of help from the United States, or from the states assembled, mainly Virginia. And that's the French and Indian War. It was at a time when England was at war a lot around the world. It's part of a larger war with France for England, and it's a war that they left nearly bankrupt. They had huge debt. Debt is going to come in. That's money. Debt comes in here. And what you're going to remember is that then they start taxing them in the Americas. The essential complaint, if there's a legitimate complaint, is that the Americans didn't have any vote in whether or not they were taxed. And they go back and forth. They taxed us once, and we said, oh, that's an internal tax, and we don't mind an external tax, but we minded that too. The fact is, Americans did not want to be taxed unless they had direct representation in the British Parliament, which the British weren't giving us, and eventually revolutionary activity left to the canceling of our parliaments. That's when we eventually revolt against England. This document, the Articles of Confederation, is written right there when that revolt happens. It's written in 1777 by a delegate from Delaware, and his name was, you're not going to remember him anyway, it's John Dickinson from Delaware. So John Dickinson from Delaware writes this document, and I'm going to highlight pieces of it. Obviously, there are many that are important, but these are the ones I think make sense, especially if you're thinking about lawyers, guns, money, and particularity. So we're going to start just at the very top, because the document sets out exactly what it intends to do. And The Article 1 says that we're going to be called the United States of America, which is very sweet. But Article 2 sets out this very high ideal. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence in every power and jurisdiction and right, which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States and Congress assembled. That's going back to 1688, friends. That is going back and saying, just like Scotland, just like Ireland, just like Wales used to have their own parliaments, and they were under the king, we had our own parliaments. We were under the king, and we should have all the rights. And after 1688, there are no other parliaments besides that one parliament that the king, I mean, after 1688, the king has very little authority. So they're kind of going back to this ideal moment where the parliaments of the local places in the British Empire are really the main thing. And each area is really separate. And then it says, well, so why are we assembling at all? Why do we have this Congress? It says the states enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for the common defense and security of their liberties. In other words, this is a defense pact. This is a pact primarily oriented around trying to defend the states. And at this time, the states had a lot of things that they had to defend against, including, the fact that they were routinely at war with Native Americans, along with the fact that, of course, they were at war with Great Britain. And they could have easily gone to war with France or Spain. All of these huge empires had borders on the United States and were themselves fighting over this, great vast territory that was clearly going to be a source of tremendous wealth. So that's Article 1 and Article 2. Now, I want to get to particularity because it does go to this thing that we talked about in the last video, that while we have this clarion call to liberty, right, ringing freedom across the generations, and definitely that clarion call is important, it's not so much reflected here. If you look at Article 4, it immediately says, to better secure the perpetual mutual friendship and intercourse. Boy, that's idealistic. Friendship through the different states in this union, the free inhabitants of these states, paupers, vagabonds, and fugitives of justice excepted, shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of free citizens in the several states. In other words, this document immediately is not including people who are enslaved. Obviously, it's most of the African-American population in the country at the time, although, very importantly, not all. And that's super important to note. There are free African-Americans in pretty much every state, lots of them in the border states, and more going up north into Philadelphia, New York. There are free African-Americans all over New England at this time, especially in Rhode Island. So the document doesn't specifically say that African-Americanness or Africanness and freedom are contradictory. But it is true, this document is not going to do this thing which happens here, which is to protect people when they go back and forth between states. That's not going to be the case for slaves who are pretty much they're all African American, and that's a later document we need to get to. And paupers and vagabonds. So understand there is a particularism in this document. So we're going to go down, and we're going to think, okay, so this document's mainly about defense, right? This is a defense-oriented document. We're going to note that this is a document that has this real ideal. It says, if you're going down to the Article 5, Article 6, we're in Article 6, and it says, no vessels of war should be kept up in time of peace by any state, except some number as should be deemed necessary by the United States and Congress assembled. So on the one hand, theoretically, these states are very independent. It's very idealistic. Massachusetts will be Massachusetts. Virginia will be Virginia. Rhode Island will be Rhode Island. On the other hand, the most basic thing that states have to do, which is to stop you from getting killed, they can't do unless they go to Congress. And that seems like a real limiting factor. So maybe you would think, okay, in here somewhere, Congress is going to really, bang on, and they're going to be the main defense force. But no dice. You can read down quite a lot, but you'll notice that basically Congress, there is no national navy, national army. But, and this is really important, Congress is the only one that can actually say that you are at war. So it's really important to note that the general sort of dish on the Articles of Confederation is that this is an anti-national government, but this is a government in which even local and state governments have very, very little power. Um, Now, the next major paragraph that you've got to deal with is in Article 9. It is incredibly long, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but if you read the section starting with, whenever the legislative or executive authority or lawful agent in any state, contrary to another, shall present a petition to Congress, stating a matter in question, hearing, notice shall be given by order of Congress, the legislative authority of the other state in controversy. This is the section that would deal with conflicts between states. To put it mildly, it's very convoluted. Read the whole thing down, you'll see that whenever there's any kind of dispute between states, what's going to happen is that Congress will nominate 3 persons out of each state, and then the Secretary of Congress will select among those 3 people per state. So out of those 33 people, they will select 1 from each state, and then those 3 people will then sit in judgment between, in any dispute between the states. And it's very complicated. But what you're kind of noticing is not there is a formal legal system. There is no appeals court. There is no Supreme Court. It's not even quite clear where the law is going to be, because this, although this is a constitution of sorts, it doesn't say exactly how they're planning on adjudicating. So you'll notice there isn't really a legal system. Finally, and this is a piece you really have to understand, it says the United States Congress shall have the sole and exclusive right and power of regulating the alloy and value of coins struck by their authority or that of the respective states, fixing weights, standards, and measures. Now, fixing weights, standards, and measures is something that goes back to the Bible, goes back to Hammurabi's Code, goes back to the Code of Al-Nura. And that would kind of like really cover making sure that the money is valuable. Because when money's not valuable, or when money changes value radically, it's totally disruptive to the economic system. There's no way that I can engage in any form of business not knowing how much the money is going to be worth in 3 or 4 months. And that's really the job of government. It's a critical job all governments have to take on, to make sure that there's a stable currency so that people who are selling paper clips can buy chickens, even if the chicken farmer doesn't want paper clips, right? That's what money's for. It's there as a placeholder for value. But, and this is really important, in this system, you will note that it doesn't cover paper money. And paper, the colonies were awash, and the new states after 1781 were awash in paper money that was largely worthless, which helps explain how the Articles of Confederation are destroyed by themselves. The one final paragraph you should note, so you would think, okay, well, these things are all difficult, but Congress could just amend that, right? They could make new laws. They could get together. They could take care of this. This would be a system that could change. Except, you'll look, and I think this is in 10. No, this is still in 9. It says the United States and Congress assembled shall never engage in war, grant littles of mark, and you keep on going down to the end, nor appoint a commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy unless 9 states assent to the same. Well, that's going to make it effectively impossible for this Congress to act. So you'll note that there's a problem here. Neither the state governments can really act on their own. They're not allowed to declare war. They're not allowed to deal with insurrection. They're not even really allowed to. They're not allowed to make their own money. They don't have much ability to. I mean, they can sort of theoretically borrow, but the federal government can't borrow. Can't do anything unless 9 out of 13 states assent. Now that's very idealistic. That almost all of us are going to really get along, but it's also bullcrap. People don't get along very well. That's just how humans are, and you need to have some kind of energetic authority. That's what we said last time. You need to have the ability for coercion. And what happened was that, there's a fun Easter egg. You want to see the Easter? We'll get the Easter egg right now. We actually include in this the idea that Canada might become a state. Of course, it never did. It actually kicked our ass in war twice. So it seems it's a long time thing that America might want Canada in. But that's Article 11. So getting back to the main point. It was clear the articles weren't working. There's a lot of reasons why. Among them, America was awash in debt, and it put pressure on 2 sets of groups. There were merchants who'd been supplying people throughout the war and essentially borrowing to do so. Many, of course, many Americans, in fact, most American men had fought in the Revolution. And while they were away from their farms, they were overland farmers, they could not, they couldn't pay their bills. And so they were borrowing. But what they were borrowing was not, they were not able to pay it back because they weren't being paid in cash. They were being paid in bills, and the bills were effectively worthless. You'll notice that this document doesn't really deal with the issue of paper money, which is an increasingly important issue. Um, and what happened was that up in Massachusetts, a group of farmers who had been paid in, relatively speaking, worthless money, who owed hard money, in other words, gold or silver, to merchants, had a rebellion. They marched on the state, on banks and small towns, and they marched to Springfield, and there was no authority for the federal government to suppress that. I mean, theoretically they could have, but 9 out of 13 states didn't vote to do that. There was no army to send in, and eventually they were defeated by a state militia. It became very, very clear that order had broken down in the United States. So there's a tremendously hopeful document that we create out of the Articles of, in the Articles of Confederation, out of the Declaration of Independence, but that ideal that you would have a firm link of friendship, that people would do things out of their goodness, etc., none of it worked. So you see that lawyers, guns, and money, it's all failed. And that's why in 1777, and 1777, 78, passed in 79, we start to write a new constitution. So we'll deal with that next time.